What history textbooks won't tell you about this legend? Here's something they don't tell you in school. Robin Hood, the guy who stole from the rich and gave to the poor, might have never existed. And even if he did, he was probably nothing like the hero we all grew up loving. So you've heard the story a million times, right? Robin Hood living in Sherwood Forest with his merry men, shooting arrows with perfect accuracy, fighting the evil sheriff of Nottingham, and saving the poor people from corrupt nobles. It's one of those legends that just feels true because we've seen it in so many movies and read it in so many books. But what if I told you that almost everything you think you know about Robin Hood is either completely made up or twisted beyond recognition? Today, we're going to dig into the real story behind this legend, and trust me, it gets weird. We're talking about centuries of lies, propaganda, political manipulation, and people just making stuff up because it sounded cool. By the end of this, you're going to look at Robin Hood completely differently. Let's start with the biggest question. Did Robin Hood actually exist? The honest answer is we have no idea. There's no solid proof that a guy named Robin Hood ever lived in medieval England. 0 birth records, no death certificate, no property documents, nothing. You'd think if someone was famous enough to become a legend, we'd have at least some evidence of their existence, right? But here's where it gets interesting. There are actually references to Robin Hood in historical documents, just not in the way you'd expect. The earliest mention we have is from the 1370s, about 150 years after Robin Hood supposedly lived. A priest named William Langland wrote a poem called Piers Plowman, and in it, one of the characters mentions knowing rhymes about Robin Hood. That's it. Just a casual reference that these stories existed. Then in the 1440s, a historian named Walter Bower wrote about Robin Hood in his Chronicle of Scottish History. He places Robin Hood around the year 1266 and describes him as a famous robber. But here's the problem. Bower was writing about events that happened almost 200 years before his time. He wasn't an eyewitness. He was basically repeating rumors and stories that had been passed down for generations. So if there's no solid evidence, where did this legend come from? Well, that's where things get really complicated. See, in medieval England, there were actually a bunch of guys with similar names. Court records show multiple people named Robert Hood, Robin Hood, or Robin Hood appearing in legal documents throughout the 1200s and 1300s. Some of them were criminals, some were regular people, and some just disappeared from records completely. One theory is that Robin Hood wasn't one person, but a combination of several different outlaws whose stories got mixed together over time. Another theory is that Robin Hood was just a generic nickname for any outlaw, kind of like how people today might call a computer hacker anonymous. There's even a theory that the name Robin Hood comes from a French term for a hooded man or a woodsman, and it just became a catch-all term for forest bandits. But let's say for a second that Robin Hood was a real person. Even if he was, the guy you're imagining is nothing like the real deal. The Robin Hood from the earliest ballads and stories is actually kind of a jerk. In the original tales from the 1400s, Robin Hood isn't this noble hero fighting for justice. He's basically just a violent criminal who likes messing with people. In one of the earliest ballads called A Jest of Robin Hood, Robin doesn't help the poor out of the goodness of his heart. He's more interested in humiliating rich people and having a good time. He's rude, he's aggressive, and he definitely doesn't have this noble moral code we associate with him today. Also, in these early stories, Robin Hood isn't even fighting against King John or Prince John like in all the movies. Those villains were added way later. In the original ballads, Robin Hood is actually loyal to the king. He's fighting against corrupt local officials, sure, but he's not some revolutionary trying to overthrow the system. When the king shows up in disguise in one story, Robin immediately bows down and pledges his loyalty. And get this, the whole love story with Maid Marian? Completely made up. Marian doesn't appear in any Robin Hood stories until the 1500s. more than 100 years after the first ballads were written. Before that, Robin Hood didn't have a love interest at all. Some historians think Marian was borrowed from a completely different set of stories and just shoved into the Robin Hood legend because people thought it made the story better. Even Friar Tuck, Little John, and the rest of the merry men, a lot of them were added over time. The earliest Robin Hood stories only mention a couple of companions, and they're not developed characters. They're just there. Later writers kept adding more people to make the stories more interesting. So if the Robin Hood we know is mostly fiction, why did this legend become so popular? Why did people keep telling these stories and adding to them for hundreds of years? The answer is actually pretty dark. Robin Hood became popular because he represented something people desperately wanted to believe in. Medieval England was brutal for most people. You had a tiny group of super wealthy nobles who owned everything, and then you had millions of peasants who were basically slaves. The legal system was completely rigged in favor of the rich. If a poor person stole a loaf of bread to feed their family, they could be hanged. But if a rich person stole land or cheated people out of money, they'd probably get away with it. In this environment, the idea of an outlaw who fought back against the system and actually won, that was powerful. It gave people hope. It made them feel like maybe, just maybe, someone could stand up to the people crushing them and come out on top. Robin Hood wasn't just entertainment. He was a fantasy of justice in a world that had none. But here's where the story gets really twisted. Over the centuries, the people in power realized they could use the Robin Hood legend for their own purposes. Instead of seeing him as a threat, they started reshaping the story to make it support the system they wanted to protect. This really kicked into gear during the 1500s and 1600s. Writers started changing Robin Hood from a rough criminal into a noble gentleman who had fallen on hard times. They gave him a backstory where he was actually a nobleman, the Earl of Huntingdon, who had been unfairly stripped of his title and lands. Suddenly, Robin Hood wasn't a peasant fighting against the upper class anymore. He was part of the upper class, trying to reclaim his rightful position. Do you see what happened there? They took a legend about class struggle and turned it into a story about a nobleman who deserved his wealth and power. The message shifted from the system is broken and needs to change to this particular case was unjust, but the system itself is fine. It's honestly brilliant propaganda when you think about it. This trend continued for centuries. By the time we get to the Victorian era in the 1800s, Robin Hood had been completely sanitized. He became this chivalrous hero who was polite, honorable, and fought for king and country. The Victorian writers loved Robin Hood because they could use him to promote their values of honor, loyalty, and respecting social hierarchy. They turned a rebel into a poster boy for the establishment. Then Hollywood got their hands on the legend, and things went completely off the rails. The 1938 film, The Adventures of Robin Hood with Errol Flynn, basically created the version of Robin Hood that most people think of today. Tight green outfit, perfect archery skills, swinging on vines, that whole thing. It was a great movie, but it had almost nothing to do with the original legends. It was pure Hollywood invention designed to sell tickets. Every Robin Hood movie since then has added its own spin. Sometimes he's fighting the Normans. Sometimes he's fighting the Saxons. Sometimes he's leading a peasant rebellion. Sometimes he's just trying to clear his name. The story changes depending on what message the filmmakers want to send, or what they think audiences want to see. And don't even get me started on the historical inaccuracies. The idea that Robin Hood lived during the time of King Richard the Lionheart and King John, that was added in the 1500s to make the story fit with real historical events people knew about. There's no evidence from the early ballads that places Robin Hood in that specific time period. People just decided it made for a better story. The whole Sherwood Forest thing? Also probably exaggerated. Yes, Sherwood Forest was a real place. And yes, outlaws did hide in forests because it was hard for authorities to catch them there. But the early ballads actually mention Barnsdale Forest in Yorkshire more often than Sherwood. Sherwood became the famous location later, probably because it sounded more romantic and mysterious. And that castle, where the Sheriff of Nottingham supposedly lived. Nottingham Castle was rebuilt so many times over the centuries that whatever building stood there in Robin Hood's supposed era is long gone. The current castle is from the 1600s, so when you visit Nottingham today and see Robin Hood tourist attractions everywhere, just remember that it's all marketing based on a legend that might not even be connected to that place. But here's what really gets me. Despite all of this, despite knowing that Robin Hood is almost certainly fiction, and that the story has been manipulated by people in power for centuries, we still love this legend. We keep making movies about it, writing books about it, telling our kids about it. Why? I think it's because Robin Hood represents something we still need. In a world where wealth inequality is worse than it's been in decades, where ordinary people feel powerless against corporations and corrupt politicians, where the legal system often favors those with money and connections, the idea of someone standing up and fighting back still resonates. We want to believe that one person can make a difference. We want to believe that justice is possible, even when the system is rigged. The thing is, the real heroes who fight against injustice don't look like Robin Hood from the movies. They're not swashbuckling adventurers who win every fight. They're ordinary people who organize, who protest, who vote, who hold the powerful accountable through legal means and social pressure. They're whistleblowers who risk their careers to expose corruption. They're journalists who investigate and report the truth. They're activists who spend years pushing for change that might not even happen in their lifetime. These real heroes don't get the Hollywood treatment. Their stories are messy and complicated. They don't always win. Sometimes they face serious consequences for standing up. But they're the ones actually making a difference, not some guy in green tights shooting arrows in a forest. And maybe that's the real lesson we should take from the Robin Hood legend. It's not that we need to wait for some perfect hero to save us. It's that the stories we tell ourselves matter. They shape how we see the world and what we think is possible. For centuries, people have been rewriting Robin Hood to fit their agenda, whether that's inspiring rebellion or supporting the status quo. So maybe instead of asking whether Robin Hood was real, we should be asking what version of the story we want to tell today. Do we want the sanitized, safe version where everything works out and the system is basically good? Or do we want to remember why this legend started in the first place, as a story about people who are so fed up with injustice that they were willing to become outlaws to fight it? The history books won't tell you that Robin Hood was probably just a collection of stories about random criminals that got mashed together and rewritten over and over again for political purposes. They won't tell you that almost every detail you know about the legend was made up by people centuries after the supposed events. They won't tell you that the Robin Hood you love is basically a corporate product designed to sell movies and merchandise. But now you know, and you get to decide what you do with that information. You can keep enjoying the legend as harmless entertainment, or you can think about why we keep coming back to this story and what it says about what we're still fighting for today. Because at the end of the day, legends don't survive for centuries by accident. They survive because they're telling us something we need to hear. Robin Hood has lasted for over 600 years, not because the story is historically accurate, but because every generation sees something in it that speaks to their struggles and their hopes. The legend isn't really about some guy in a forest. It's about the eternal tension between those who have power and those who don't, between those who benefit from the system and those who are crushed by it, between the world as it is and the world as it should be. And as long as that tension exists, people will keep telling stories about heroes who fight against impossible odds to make things right. So yeah, history textbooks won't tell you the truth about Robin Hood, but maybe that's okay. Because the truth is that Robin Hood is us. He's every person who's ever looked at injustice and thought someone should do something about this. He's the part of us that refuses to accept that the world has to be unfair. He's the hope that things can be better. And that's a legend worth keeping alive, even if every single detail is made up. If you want to learn more about historical myths and legends that aren't what you think, hit that subscribe button. Retry.